Welcome to Reopening a Safe, Secure Campus After Covid-19. My name is Alistair Lawrence and I am the Special Projects Editor at Times Higher Education. We've had almost 500 registrations for this webinar from more than 50 countries, so I think that proves what a timely issue this is, and thank you all very much for joining us. Today I'm also joined by a panel of experts from academia and industry who will discuss the next phase of the university's sector's recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. So I would like to welcome today John Jabilian, who is the Director of Higher Education from Deloitte, Trevor Payne, who is the Director of Estates from the University of Birmingham, and Geshri Gunasekera, who is Senior Director of Institution Success from Salesforce. This is the latest in a series held in partnership with THE and Salesforce.org. So I would like to hand over to Geshri to talk a little bit about how Salesforce.org are working with universities during this period to help with campus reopenings.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alistair, and thank you to everybody joining us today. As Alistair mentioned, my name is Geshri Gunasekera, and I am the Senior Director of Institution Success at Salesforce.org. I know these are challenging times and everyone has so much to balance and organize and everything going on at their institution. To set the tone for today's discussion, this tweet stood out to me from the Higher Education Minister, Michelle Donelan, who listed reopening campuses and online learning as a key area that higher education leaders should be focusing on currently. And so, on the next slide, given every education leader that we speak to agrees, reopening in this new normal will be a challenge. Salesforce, we built Work.com as a set of solutions to reopen campuses safely and help guide you through that next normal. Built on the CRM platform, Work.com for Education Cloud provides a suite of apps designed to help schools and universities reopen safely, and solutions to help enable that strategic decision-making for your leaders, your faculty, and staff regarding health and wellness, manual contact tracing, and facilities preparedness to help manage this crisis today, but also thrive tomorrow. On the next slide, you'll see that in talking to our education customers, what we hear is really them asking before they can open all of these sorts of questions and considerations to think through, because returning to campus will look different than before. So have a think. Do any of these resonate with you? How do you assess your institutions and your faculty and staff's readiness to return to school? How can you reimagine your institution to adapt to new policies and a new normal? And since no institution has gone through this before, where can you go for guidance to reopen safely? So finally, I welcome you to explore our guide for how to lead and build resilience for the next normal. Look out for the COVID-19 education playbook that we will circulate following this webinar. And Alistair, I will hand it back to you. We have so much to discuss. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Geshri. There's one other note just to say that we will be taking questions towards the end of the session. So if you have any questions as the discussion goes along, please do let us know. If you just drop it into the chat box, then a colleague will relate those to me before we finish up here today. Great. So I think we should probably start at the top when we were considering all the topics that we could discuss for this webinar. And I think it's important to begin by just recovering what blended learning models are already helping to optimize the student experience, because there's been a tremendous response from the sector already, and campus reopenings will be another part of that. But perhaps it's useful to look at how universities have adjusted already when we start to think about campus reopenings. So, I mean, I was wondering if anyone wanted to pick that up and just talk a little bit about blended learning models that had stood out to them, or anything that they would like to relate from their own experience of dealing with the sector. Pretty quiet. Okay,
I'll go first. Yeah. So I guess the first thing I'd say from a Birmingham perspective is we haven't closed. So when we talk of reopening, actually we reduced activity, and that activity was focused around COVID support, critical research, and other key things we were doing. So we sort of reduced, and we're now building back up. We switched at pace though, so we suddenly moved a whole load of activity from a student perspective and a learning perspective, but also the way we do business as the organization. We moved that online very, very quickly. And, 12 months ago, we wouldn't have contemplated that we could do this, but we did it. So admittedly, some of that transition was quick because we had to do it quickly. But now as we're starting to think ahead, and certainly for the next academic year, we're starting to think about that blended environment, the content, the way it's put together. And this isn't just a rehash of recorded lectures. This is about trying to make sure that we can really make the best of the experience and really try and make sure that we're equitable for those people that can make it to campus or those people that need to access the information at home. So I still think there's a lot of learning that we're doing at the moment. And actually the learning is across the board because we're having to work with lecturers to feel more comfortable in this type of environment, sitting in front of a camera and trying to get a message over. So, it's been interesting from a number of different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
John, can you tell us about sorry, go ahead. It'd be interesting to hear about the conversations you've been having with the sector during this period.
Yeah, and I think just echoing some of what Trevor said, what we encountered here in the US, and I also work with one of the major UK universities, so I've sort of been seeing this from both sides of the pond. The initial response, because of course this happened midstream this spring, was that we'll do whatever we can to provide meaningful online experiences, distance learning experiences to our students. But fundamentally, we have to leverage what we've got. And so what 99% of our clients did was basically rely on their existing learning management systems and do their best. And they asked their instructors to make decisions vis-a-vis, are we going to be still meeting via Zoom, or are we going to move to a much more asynchronous model? And they kind of crossed their fingers and hoped that things would be okay. And I think the verdict is in that things were just okay. If you look at some of the data on like student satisfaction, it's pretty low. And I think we all have to kind of admit to ourselves that that should have been expected. First, because students primarily didn't sign up for that kind of learning, but second, that we were all scrambling to make it happen. And many of our learning management environments and the ways that we have embraced those learning management environments are really like sub-optimized. As we all know, right? Not every, but most universities allow faculty to determine to what extent they're using those digital tools to facilitate the pedagogy, right? So some faculty really embrace the digital tools even in a on-campus learning setting and set up their courses fully online, use all the bells and whistles, and the students can, even within the on-premises environment, sort of toggle between a digital modality and an in-person modality. But there are other faculty members who really don't embrace much at all. Maybe they post a syllabus. So that plagued us a bit this spring. And, answering your question more directly, Alistair, I think as we go into the fall, there's a full spectrum of institutions that are sort of staying the course with the ad hoc to trying to really pivot to a richer use of existing tools, expansion of existing tools, and also like change management methods to get their faculty to do more and to embrace the digital opportunity.
Yes, and building off of what John is saying around that change management, I think what we've seen here is really the wraparound services that encompass the academic experience for students can really play an important role, whether that's through advising or case management with students, and really bring those services to get that feedback loop much faster. So instead of waiting till the end of the term to understand, well, how did the students feel about that experience, that online experience, being able to have that feedback loop, those surveys or that case management happen week by week even, can really help inform not only the faculty, but also quickly make those improvements. And we've seen that in cases like Babson College, for example, which is a smaller college, but again, a way to scale that change management very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Trevor, I just wanted to like respond quickly to Geshri. I think this surrounding services thing is really important because I was really speaking directly to like learning management systems, because frankly, the learning management systems are really have been the only truly student-facing digital capabilities that institutions have consistently implemented. Lots of institutions have lots of point solutions for like self-service, but they're truly they're generally point solutions. We think that this crisis may be a catalyst to creating more of a holistic student digital experience for institutions, where not just the learning management will be presented in like a pleasing, delightful way, but that all of the different things that a student might do on campus or in a setting where they can't be on campus would be packaged in a way that they could interact with them in a much more seamless, streamlined way, as opposed to sort of hunting and pecking across the multiple digital properties at an institution.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be from a lot of the conversations that we have at THE is about building out what we loosely term the university's digital estate, in terms of the suite of tools that are available, not just to students, but I would say equally importantly to staff, so that their workload is manageable, and you build staff training in as part of that. That seems to be the consensus. I think from, again, the conversations we've had, there seems to be some really interesting innovations around AI and how you can bake things like that into digital solutions, because it gives students better response times to more mundane questions, and it also frees up a huge amount of capacity from university administrators to not be having to give the same information out time and time again. So I think this all leads into our second point for discussion, which is tracking your institution's readiness to reopen. And Trevor, I appreciate that your reopening at Birmingham is probably more like a phased transition, but there are other aspects to Birmingham's estate, such as, I mean, the Dubai campus that I believe was scheduled to open next year. It'd be interesting to find out how Birmingham's coordinating its international approach, given it is an international university.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I pick up the Dubai point, first of all, I mean, the interesting point is actually construction in Dubai has continued all the way through. There have been some local restrictions and they were slightly ahead of us in terms of controls. But in terms of the construction program, it's bang on the money where it needs to be at this moment in time. And which almost makes us the constraint to the process, because we're sort of playing catch up on some things, but everything's running to plan on that, and that's been really, really interesting and actually quite heartening to see, because you need some touch points throughout all of this sort of change. You need some normality, you need some process that continues to operate whilst we consider how we can do things differently and better. I mean, in terms of building readiness or how we consider readiness to open in Birmingham, we really early on, we agreed a set of principles and a framework with our university council to say, look, this is how we're going to approach restricted operation. This is how we're going to approach phased reopening. This is how we're going to get ready for the start of the next academic year. And we had to do it in a number of phases. So we maintained some services. We switched some services completely over to digital and remote. So we're having to support people who are working off-site in a way that we hadn't before, with all of the challenges that comes with that. And your point around digital, actually we've road tested the digital infrastructure in a way that we have never done before. And it's a testament that actually we're continuing to do business, but we've all had the experiences of the clunky Teams or Zoom calls where we get photobombed and stuff drops out, but we've lived through that. And actually we mustn't lose sight of actually some really, really good learning, some good experiences from all of this. And I don't think we'll row back from all of this when this is all done. Actually, we'll keep some of those things that work, and we mustn't lose sight of that. But in terms of readiness, we took a view that we had to get the campus up and operational so that we could start to get some activity on campus, get the community working again, and then get ready for students so that we can provide some face-to-face activity come September when students come back to campus. And that's the bit of work we're doing at the moment. That's been really challenging because it's a really deep dive process around learning spaces. What do they look like? What will it feel like? How will people access them? You know, what's the learning experience going to be like? What's the student experience going to be like that wraps around that? Because we focus on the learning spaces quite rightly, but actually there's so much more to the experience that we need to wrap in. And, you know, offers and things, amenities, other things on campus are restricted a little bit at the moment. So we've got to be really clear about what we have, how you can access it, what it's going to feel like, because we want no surprises with this. We want to give the best possible student experience. And the way to do that is to be 100% honest and open and clear about what's going to be different, what's going to work, what are you going to have to just work with us a little bit on, because we're fathoming some of this out as we go. And it's okay to say we don't have the answers to all of these problems as well.
Yeah, I mean,
I love Trevor's point on communication. You know, I think that's so critical. That's something that we've seen as well, Trevor, is, you know, it's funny, buzzy terms like contact tracing can sometimes dominate the way universities and colleges are aiming to prepare and reopen. But contact tracing is only effective to a certain degree of contagion or spread, and areas like strategic communications are always effective, you know, to your point, especially around global campuses or large universities. And so, yeah, I love that point. I always emphasize that as well, because it can be easily overlooked because it isn't as connected to the health crisis that we're in, but in fact, it's very much a core fundamental for managing any kind of crisis. So I love that point.
When we're talking about the broader student experience, I mean, I'm mindful of a feature that we've run in THE this week about the changes to student accommodation that have been impacted by all of this. And obviously, again, there are a huge amount of unknowns in terms of, you know, what the international intake is going to bring over the next 12 months, how those figures are going to be affected. Trevor, I was just wondering, your experience at Birmingham in terms of the different ways in which universities manage their student accommodation now, mainly along the lines of in terms of what they own and what they don't. How much has that impacted your planning during this period?
Well, the majority of our UG accommodation is ours. We manage it, we own it. We set the rules on how that's used. So we've been able to manage it ourselves, but we also deal with some local providers as well. So we very early in the process, we looked at some commonality around how we were going to communicate, things we were going to do to support students, because there was a lot of unknowns. And in fact, all the way through, we've had over 1,000 students on campus all the way through that we've continued to look after and communicate with and to provide some sort of experience. But I think that's going to be a really, really important thing as students start to think about coming back. You know, we're talking about the learning environment, but the social part and the sort of the basic needs that they'll have. You know, we've got challenges around quarantine, we've got challenges around early arrivals. So how do we keep people supported and looked after before the term starts? You know, I think it's going to be a really interesting new academic year, but from an accommodation perspective, I think it's important to give people clear guidance and, you know, to get that right, because people feel much more comfortable if you can get the basics right.
Sean?
I think like everything else in the United States right now, I would say that our environment for return to campus and getting ready for the students is chaotic. We've got, you know, as everyone knows, 50 states, 5,000 institutions, and every institution is doing this differently. So there is, and I don't mean to be like negative here, but there is mass confusion. And I think accordingly, the media is really latching onto this as a topic. And every day there are news articles in the major news outlets about, you know, this university is doing this university is doing that, and literally run the gamut from the Cal State system, which is fully online, to institutions which have their heads in the sand and don't seem to be even communicating about any major changes. That being said, I think I would, you know, for the schools that I'm working most closely with and have connections to, I would say, Trevor, things are similar in terms of getting ready for faculty and staff to be on site first, and then looking at that whole student experience and how that whole student experience can be as rich as possible considering what's going on. I know, Geshri, you mentioned the contact tracing topic, and I think very directly related to COVID and health and safety. We are having a lot of conversations about how best to allow students to self-check, let's say every morning, perhaps create some sort of a ticket to ride on their phone that either gives them something they can show as I've done my check, or that might even have a barcode or some other sort of capability to let them in or not let them into certain buildings. Some institutions have also thought about connecting that ticket to ride to Wi-Fi access, which I think is, for this day's students, would be a pretty good stick, in the carrot and stick kind of model. And then, from that point, if someone is showing some symptoms, how do we manage that? The other capability that I've seen a couple of institutions, even some of our smaller customers, look at is not just sort of the proximity tracking regarding like devices for contact tracing, but also just for, and Trevor, this may resonate for you guys, for density management. So to just, allow a student before they enter a building to see, is this building a red, a yellow, or a green, right? If it's red, there are already too many people in the building. So I think that's a pretty interesting, application of technology. But overall, we are all over the map in the U.S. And the other thing, and I mean, I think this depends on where you are across the world and our country. But because COVID is now outbreaking again, as you guys have all probably seen in the news in the U.S., things are even more up in the air. And there were, again, news stories yesterday saying that 3 or 4 institutions that had planned to reopen and have students on campus have now gone to full online mode for the fall. And that's, and they'd already committed and students were already planning on returning, and now they're going fully online because of the fact that this thing is still really unpredictable.
Geshri, I wanted to ask from a supplier side, I know this is a conversation I've heard at the previous events we've done in this series, is one of the things that people are mindful of is introducing an LMS or a CRM that is not too big brothery over the students, and that makes them feel comfortable that they have support, but they're not having their every move monitored. I mean, I was just wondering if you're still having those kind of conversations with your university partners.
It's an interesting question. I think where most of the concern has been is actually in providing students, faculty, staff with enough information in a personalized and meaningful way. We've talked about students at large so far, but we've seen universities that we work with, London School of Economics, for example, really take a fine-tuned approach to looking at incoming first-year students, for example, and thinking about how can we really provide them with the information that they need based on where we know they're coming from, based on which campus they may be attending. So to Trevor's point, some of these universities are global in nature. And to John's point, the COVID situation isn't uniform globally or even within the country, sometimes even here in the US. So being able to use personalized information to really get what students find most relevant is really critical, because there's so much noise. There's so much urgency in almost everything you read related to COVID-19. And really, I think everybody's just asking themselves, what am I supposed to do? So I think that trade-off of just getting the relevant information has taken the priority. And of course, at Salesforce, we place a premium on ethical, humane use of technology. So this is a principle that we keep in mind with our technology, and we have those conversations with our communities as well. but I think that need to have really personalized, relevant information has just become so critical. Trevor, I was actually going to ask you a question around that, given your global nature of your institution. Do you find that you are having to take very different approaches based on country and campus?
Yeah, we are, because the pandemic is hitting in different ways in different time zones, and we're having to react differently. I mean, there's a huge amount of commonality, but local controls need local solutions. I think the point, linking back to digital and picking up the point, I mean, now more than ever is the time to make the case for the intelligent building. So from an estates perspective, smart would be so helpful for me at the moment in terms of, density management was mentioned, tracking people on campus, temperature testings come up on the chat. We've got CCTV systems. Now's not the time, I guess, because we've got so much to pull together at the moment to be making huge step changes. But thinking ahead, there's some of the things that we absolutely need to start to do, because we could make the buildings help us manage this in so much smarter ways than we are at the moment. I'm having to go back really to an old school approach with people on the doors with a clipboard, actually, to manage people in and out, because that's the only way I can hand on heart say, this is the capacity in a socially distanced way in this building. We can use it safely if I have this many in the morning, this many in the afternoon. If we didn't do that, chaos would start, and we can't do that. We've got to try and manage these things safely, because the return to campus really has got to be based on assurance. We've got to, we almost have to persuade some staff to come back because they're nervous, and quite rightly so. So we need to assure them that we're acting safely and we're looking after them. And then we need to make sure that we're consistent, because what we have noticed when we brought people back, actually, if you do it well, they get used to it very quickly. And when they get used to it, actually, they get a little bit complacent. And all of a sudden, you have to keep reminding them about social distancing. And this is going to be a huge and ongoing challenge, I think, moving forward. But systems, data, technology could make this so much easier. But I just don't think we're in a position at the moment to implement some of those things. But we absolutely need to learn the lessons and make the case, because it's how we bounce back and how we prepare ourselves for things like this in the future.
Yeah, I'm now picturing nightclub bouncers on the doors in Birmingham, but that's probably not accurate. I just want to say it does seem to tie with the DFE guidance that was published on the 17th of July, which said it may be appropriate to consider reopening low density buildings such as informal learning spaces as a phased way of extending access to campus while still safeguarding the need of staff and students. And to the point that John made earlier, that there could be some kind of technology that gives students and staff too prior warning about what are being referred to as pinch points are. So things are becoming too densely populated. The other side of this, of course, is how do you provide in-person teaching in a socially distanced manner? And again, this is to be there's a requirement now to, I think Universities UK referred to it last month as providing new ways of providing practical sessions in socially distant forms, and really asking universities to come up with innovative approaches to extracurricular activities as well. So, I mean, there's a lot to get into there. I mean, that really runs the gamut of the whole student experience. But, I mean, it seems to be that the universities are moving along the right lines with this. I mean, that they are acutely aware of that. And it will be interesting to see what become the prevailing systems, because every campus is different, but there is the same requirement for all of them.
Well, and to your point, Alistair, I think so many of our universities globally contribute so much from a research perspective, and that laboratory environment requires, to a degree, an in-person presence, right? You can't reenact all of that in your home. So what we've seen is universities take a phased stakeholder group in terms of reopening, saying, these types of students, that are studying these majors, or students that are involved with this kind of research, they become part of the priority groups that are coming back, so that research can continue, because often that research is also tied to the institution's contributions as a whole. So that's been interesting to observe.
So I think the challenge, I mean, from an estate's perspective, I'm confident we'll be in a position in September where we've mapped the estate, we've identified how we can socially distance all of our learning spaces, and we've linked that to the timetable. So we have an experience that we can share and that students can buy into and work with. The challenge for me, though, is being really smart about how do we use that timetable to make sure we continue to work safely. So simple things like not discharging all of the students on the hour at the same time into the same corridors, because we can control the learning spaces and actually the teaching and learning environment. I think we'll manage that well. I think it will be different. I mean, if you've only got to think about giving a lecture in a close fitting face covering, that's going to be a first, isn't it? So, you know, we're thinking of, you know, these clear face visors at the moment, so people can still see the lecturer, but there's a degree of protection, but actually they're quite distant from the students anyway, if they're up at the lectern at the front. So actually, I think you just need to have time to work through these challenges with lecturers and with the groups to get to a point where people start to feel comfortable and you can still do business. You can still provide great learning and great teaching in a safe way. But the simple things I think are going to catch us out. So it won't be the learning spaces, it will be the corridors. It will be the transition from building to building, on-site, off-site, toilets, going to be a challenge, shared areas, catering facilities. So we have to put equal focus on all of those elements because they're all part of the campus experience. So we can't just have it 100% right in one area. It has to flow and it has to work as a sort of cohesive approach here.
Alistair, I wanted to pick up on two things, that one thing that Geshri said and one thing that Trevor said. So Geshri, I totally agree with you about like the imperative for communication. And, but I also agree with Trevor, or I kind of empathize with Trevor that like, although we know that there's technology out there that could allow us to like personalize, individualize, target, AI drive communication, right now we're still in, you know, scramble mode to get to, you know, whatever opening day is. And so there's like this, at least I feel like a lot of us have already sort of acknowledged like where we could be, but there's a challenge where we are. And Trevor, just like what you were talking, again, responding to what you were talking about, you know, around like, well, when do we let the students out of classes? How do we manage like hallways and restrooms? To me, the thing that jumps out is like, how do I like communicate all that? Mm-hmm. Right? So like, even though like I might have a great plan, or you might have, yeah. I might have a great plan, or you might have a great plan. Like, how do you communicate it, and how do you communicate it in a way that it's like timely, mm-hmm. right? Because we know that students don't read email, and it was funny when you were talking about the clipboard, right? One of my clients, I mean, and this is a major U.S. university that you've all heard of, right? They said to me last month, the best way to communicate is to put signs out in the quad, right, with instructions, right? I mean, it just boggles me, but I understand it. So what we have seen in terms of like quick hits, and we've done this now with our one of our UK university clients and with one of our US university clients, is quickly turning up a texting capability tied to their underlying CRM technology. And what that allows us to do is, instead of just, you know, using like mass emailing, it allows us to do at least mass texting, and depending on the sophistication of sort of the communications technology, more focused texting. It doesn't solve every problem, and it is highly dependent on the institution having some of the underlying data and CRM tech to drive the communications, but we are able to do that one pretty quickly. And I was just having a conversation with another one of the big Ivy League schools here about pivoting to get that texting capability up and running in a matter of weeks.
Well, John, I think what's so important, what you're getting at really, is also an issue around equity. I think one of the you know, unfortunate outcomes of this crisis has been a real spotlight on issues of equity that exist certainly here in the United States, certainly around the world, where, making assumptions that students will be able to, even if they wanted to receive that over email, they may not have access to the smartphones that we all have here on the call. So being able to communicate in lower tech forms, whether that's text or otherwise, has really risen to the forefront, as well as we try to make sure nobody gets left behind in these important communications.
I think that's an important point. Digital poverty. We all assume that everyone has access to technology, and we mustn't make that assumption. So I think going back to basics through this crisis has actually been quite useful in terms of understanding who do we need to communicate with, how frequently, how do we best do it, and what are the messages, and having some consistency around that. And sometimes you have to break it down and be really, really simple. So the signs in the quad, I sort of get, but it's perhaps not where we should be moving forward.
I think it's, with the question of access is quite an interesting one, because pre-COVID, I remember speaking to one DVC of teaching and learning who said that they had, it's in a low-income area of the UK, they had mass issued iPads to all new starters, because it achieved two things really. One, it gave a sort of a digital baseline where they knew what technology their students would be learning when they sent out learning materials to them. And also it removed the stigma of the people who have and don't have access to this. And he said it was a huge success. I mean, they issued several hundred, and I think they had literally one loss and one breakage amongst it, in the face of quite a lot of skepticism that the scheme would work. So I do wonder if schemes such as those may become more widespread. It's obviously a cost to bear, but it does level the playing field for all students.
I mean, personally, I think it's a great idea. If you think about a preloaded tablet with everything on there, timetable information, you could have your social aspects on there as well. It becomes, a really vital part of life on campus. And if we could provide that, I think that actually could be cost effective. I mean, we shouldn't see it as a prohibitive thing. Actually, we should think about all the benefits we would get in doing that. Starting lectures on time, getting people to the right place on time, getting information in a timely manner. So we should see it as a tool to drive productivity rather than, a challenge around cost.
I think another thing that it was said to address was the digital skills gap, which can be such a problem for new starters. So it's not just the access that students have to these devices, it's their capability when they're using them. And I know from some of the news stories we've run about Australia, but I think it will be a requirement in other countries as well, just to the increased requirements on universities to teach job-ready skills and to prepare students for the workforce. We're perhaps entering an era where that could become more of a challenge if the devices and the contact hours become more and more fragmented and more siloed as people come back to university. I wanted to ask just a couple of quick questions about staggering the restart dates for students, because it's something that's been talked about a bit here. And there's certain UK universities who are considering a January restart date for postgraduates, just to break things up a little bit. I was wondering if Trevor or any of the other panelists had conversations along those lines.
We've certainly had conversations about it. I mean, we haven't quite landed on all of the detail at the moment, but you have to keep everything on the table at the moment because it's such a moving picture. And actually what's driving quite a few of those decisions is physical capacity. So the worst thing we could do is recruit and get a huge intake of international students. We bring them all over and they sit on campus and we've got nowhere to actually teach them, and we've got nothing to do for them in terms of a campus experience. So we do need to think about how we manage that. The ideal is we try and keep it pretty much as close to normal as possible, but that means a blended approach of face-to-face on campus, access to specialist areas such as labs, one-to-one tutorials wherever possible. Whether or not we can do all of that at the traditional start date of an academic year, I'm not sure. So I think all of those things need to be considered. But, I don't think we're alone in considering that. I mean, that has to be, UK-wide and probably more of a global consideration as well.
Yes, I agree. And what's been interesting, Alistair, you asked about the staggering of the start date. I've actually also seen on the end date. Also, a lot of conversation there, especially here in the US, ending around what is typically the flu season in the autumn and what is around typically the US Thanksgiving holiday. So many universities thinking about starting a little earlier so that they may end earlier, and then the students return home, which I've seen also theories around that problematic approach as well.
Yeah.
So, it's just such a tough challenge.
Yeah, I think that, I was talking about sort of the inconsistency and the variability across all of our states and universities, but there are a couple sort of, and Geshe's alluding to one of them, there are a couple sort of leading approaches that seem to be getting traction. One I call the Notre Dame plan because they were the first to do it. And Geshe, that's the one where Notre Dame University, which is one of our biggest brands, let's say, in the US, is going back early so they can be done by our Thanksgiving holiday. And a bunch of institutions have taken that approach, which I guess the theory, and they've eliminated the fall break. So it's sort of like, we'll get you here, we'll keep you here, and then we'll send you home early. The other one is, I've seen a number of big schools like Stanford University, and then some of our small elite liberal arts colleges, which is a thing that's kind of particular to the US, go with this like class slicing. And Trevor, this gets to like density and ability to like house students. So what I know Stanford is doing, they typically run a trimester system. So now they're saying they're going to be, and they always had a summer trimester, but it was lightly attended. But now they're going to make that a full-fledged or now it's a quarter, right? But a full-fledged term, and they're only having like freshmen and seniors this fall, so first years and fourth years, and then they're going to rotate the classes through. And one of our leading liberal arts colleges, which is called Bowdoin, which Geshe probably knows because it's about 30 minutes from her right now in Maine, they're only having freshmen and students who need that like hands-on interaction with not just people, but with things. Like I need to be in front of some sort of piece of research, like a centrifuge or something. You can tell I'm not a scientist.
I mean, does this raise another question about capacity in terms of if we are to shrink class sizes and stagger classes throughout the year, the impact on the teaching provision and whether there is simply enough resource under the existing model to serve all of these students on a different timetable?
Well, so one of the conversations I've listened to from networking with colleagues through either the U21 network or through the Russell Group or EAB is that people are considering different start times and finish times. So they're looking at early starts, late finishes. They're looking at working through Wednesday afternoons where typically sports have taken place. They're considering Saturday mornings. So that they're trying to work with the capacity. There's a fixed amount of capacity, and there's growing detail about the workload and the student capacity, and it's trying to fit the two together. You can do that by staggered start, staggered shift, on-site, off-site, half and half. But I think you have got to try and, going back to what I said about trying to keep everything on the table, you've got to think about all of the variables. And that might mean the traditional teaching week changes slightly. And that either stretches or works in different ways. So I know lots of universities are having those conversations at the moment.
You know what's interesting about this conversation, I was looking through the Q&A, there are lots of questions around social distancing. I think the university can make all the best laid plans for social distancing and staggered start times for the academic part of the student's life, but keep in mind we're talking about young people here. And by the way, I no longer count myself as a young person, but young people like hanging out with other young people. And that's the other big consideration I think that many institutions have to take in mind is that, you know, what happens on the weekend, what happens in the evenings. And we have seen some challenges with that already here in the US with the Greek system that our universities have, where you can have the best intentions with the in classroom and in the state experience. but socially, it's still a challenge.
Yes, to echo that point, I was just thinking about what would happen if I'd been told I needed to attend lectures on a Saturday morning when I was an undergraduate. But anyway, those days are far behind me, thankfully. I wonder if we had time to speak about international students a little bit. It's another huge variable, and obviously it's massively dependent on where in the world they are coming from. But again, I was just wondering if anyone had any thoughts about how this might impact on schemes such as student exchanges, and also another point that we had on the agenda, which was tracking and maintaining student and staff welfare and mental well-being. International students are potentially a high risk group for this, given how they're isolated already from their culture and their family when they come over as an 18-year-old undergraduate or whatever. Now there's an extra layer of isolation on top of that, assuming they do travel. Is there a requirement for a bespoke plan for engaging with and managing international students through this process?
I think there has to be. From conversations we've had, I mean, there are different expectations that different international students will have because of things that are routine from where they're coming from. So, Chinese students, temperature checking and temperature testing is actually baked in. So they would expect us or a UK university to have that as part of the normal routine operation. So it's trying to understand how you can sort of identify what those expectations are and where you can deliver them. But from our perspective, temperature testing may not add anything to what we want to do, but it may be a level of assurance that actually it's worth investing in just to make sure that you do look out for particular cohorts or groups of students. That's just one example.
John, do you think it's the sort of thing where there will be a similar levels of disparity across the US, given the different approaches you've spoken about so far?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. I also think we're in a unique situation at the moment because, as I mentioned before, things are flaring. So I would suspect that many international students will decide not to come back, at least on site, to our universities. What I have heard is there are lots of international students who never went home. So that's another cadre that we would have to think about too. And a number of our institutions have housed those students through the crisis. So I agree with Trevor that there are going to be lots of nuanced expectations and requirements around international. And again, what I think we talked about earlier on in the call is, and again, it may not be something we can have ready for this year, but it's something to contemplate going forward, is if we could create the true wraparound digital experience, it could inherently be localized, personalized for different groups of international students to help orchestrate their, arrival, their readiness to arrive, their arrival, and then their student life.
Geshri, from a supplier side, I was wondering, for the tools that Salesforce make, like the Advisor Link and other monitoring tools that you have in your suite of products, is there a capability, or do you think there'd be a requirement to actually add perhaps bespoke systems and checks that can be applied to high-risk students and staff to be fair?
So I think we absolutely see universities wanting to take a personalized, highly segmented approach to their constituents, whether those are students, first years, international students, whether it's even donors, alumni, various faculty and staff. And I think that this is where, when you think about implementing technology, and Trevor, you spoke to that tension that exists at a university where you must act now, you need to implement something, you may not have the resources or even the time to really implement anything too complicated. This is where having a focus on a platform that is highly configurable can be so critical, because as we've hit on many times in this panel, everyone will have a different approach and at different times in the coming years potentially. And so this is where you will need to collect different data points potentially. You will need to have different actions based off of those data points. And so I think having a platform like a CRM that is highly configurable really gives you that freedom, that flexibility to adapt the technology to the vision of what you need in the moment, as opposed to, you know, a point, you know, a thing in a box, as I like to call it, that cannot adjust as well.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions, so I do want to leave some time for them at the end, but one thing I wanted to flag before we wrap up our panel discussion was a survey of about 4,000 international students by IDP Connect that THE reported on this month, and it noted that there was an increasing willingness by students to start their courses online and transition to campus-based study when that became feasible. And I think that's something that has really shifted since around kind of March or April time. Is obviously, Trevor, you spoke right at the top of this about, may have been John, excuse me, about sort of the low levels of student satisfaction with the shift to online, but student expectations definitely seem to be shifting alongside what universities are planning or are being capable of offering students, I think, which hopefully bodes well for the next term. Okay, so we have a few, apologies if we don't get through all the questions that we've been asked, but I will try and get through the ones I have in front of me. So we have a question from Lindsay Thomas, which says, can you talk a little bit about a high flex model incorporating physical delivery, synchronous online and asynchronous online? Is it a workable solution or just a compromise which satisfies no one? I'm not sure entirely. I think it's, yeah, I think it's a difficult one for anyone to answer in abstract, to be honest with you. All I can say just to reiterate the points on THE's reporting on this question, is that the online and in-person models are changing and shifting constantly, and the huge amount of variation there is across the sector means that there is unlikely to be a single solution that works for everyone. And so much of it also, when you boil down to the curricula that's being taught, the type of student that you're engaging with as well. One thing we haven't touched on is how all of this syncs with increased requirements for civic engagement and lifelong learning, which is probably a whole other panel discussion in itself. But I think from what I've read so far in our pages that things are constantly moving and changing, and so no one model will be the standard.
To build on what you were saying, Alistair, I think that's spot on, and especially in the context of non-traditional students that existed pre-COVID and will exist post-COVID as well, where you have students that are potentially with children, they're taking care of family members, they're potentially working. I think the openness to new models that this crisis has created is perhaps a good thing, because it ultimately may allow us to deliver courses and academic journeys that meet the students where they are in their lives, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, and again, like, does this crisis lead to an opportunity? I feel like there's been a longstanding missed opportunity for better synchronous learning across on-prem and online cadres, and or on-prem cadres at different institutions. And I say synchronous because I envision this as a chance for not just students to like watch a live lecture or engage, not just to like watch a live lecture, but actually to create groups and collaborate across boundaries. I agree, Geshri, that on the asynchronous side, or like and or regarding like remote learning that could be for traditional learners or lifetime learners, I think there is also a big opportunity. I view the synchronous and asynchronous as very different offerings. I think that a lot of our the institutions that have focused on online up until COVID, their pedagogies are very different than the online experience that our traditionally on-prem institutions have offered. So I'm expecting that there'll be a evolution of what is really a on-prem course being offered online to truly asynchronous offerings in the future.
Okay, thanks everyone. We have another question from Anonymous for Trevor, which I think is particularly speaks to estates management. It asks, has the pandemic made you rethink your future capital investments? Will you need to redraw the plans, e.g. for accommodation and common spaces? And will you be ensuring that the health of the students is at the forefront of your plans? I think you've already answered the last part over the course of the discussion. So maybe if you have anything that you could tell us about rethinking future capital investments and redrawing plans.
Sure. So in short, yes, yes, and yes is the answer.
Right.
So from a capital perspective, of course, we've paused because we just need to understand how is this going to play out. So we had a really detailed, worked up capital plan that we were delivering. It's right and proper to pause that. I think from a space perspective, if we think about office and support space around the campus, first of all, people are working in different ways, and actually things are getting done. Things are, there might be some question marks about productivity, but we need to understand, so what does a future campus need to look like now? What do we have? What do we need? And then how do we sort of transition so that we can start to rationalize the estate that we have? So we may look for a blended model of support service delivery in the future, which is less offices on campus, more remote working, or a blend of the two. That means less real estate. That might mean changing the estate around a little bit. That may mean there's an opportunity for learning spaces. We don't know. We need to work through all of that. So the answer is yes, we're rethinking where we go with capital at the moment, but we're not alone. Most universities are doing that at the moment. Yes, we're considering about how we move forward with space and how we use space in a different way. And I think it's right and proper to do that.
Great. Okay, and we're close to time. I think we've got time for one last question. This is from Julian Gould-Williams, and he asks, could you let us know what apps are available for monitoring people density in buildings and any other apps that may be useful? John mentioned these points.
So there's a couple I'm aware of. I wouldn't say I necessarily endorse them. So Safe Zone is a system at the moment which you can map movement of people around campus. I'm particularly interested in that one because we mentioned earlier about mass communication. So it's important as part of major incident and emergencies that you've got the ability to burst the message out to multiple people, staff and students in one hit. But there are others. So that's just one that springs to mind.
Okay.
Yes, and the other side of that is managing shift management as well of your staff that are working at the institution. So on the proactive side, managing who is coming in when, that's certainly an area we've seen. And then I know there's another one, degree analytics, which is monitoring student density in classrooms based on Wi-Fi pings, which is, I think, pretty interesting as well because it builds off of the existing infrastructure at the university.
John, were there any in particular that you'd like to name check?
Not brand names, but what we're doing is we're typically mining the data that we've got in existing higher ed systems, in particular the student information system, but also then of course key card swipes, and then providing real-time analytics based on that underlying data.
Okay, great. All right. Well, those all sound like interesting solutions and tools that will become more commonplace in the future. I apologize, we haven't been able to get through all the questions you've had, but I think we've covered an awful lot of ground in just under an hour. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I think we've had a really healthy turnout for this. And I'd also like to thank my panelists for giving us their time and their expertise. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. And yes, thank you very much for your time. We'll leave it there.